Hello and welcome back to Old Soul Podcast. My name is Bria. It's spelled B-R-E-I. Thank you so much. Today's podcast episode is going to be about The Invitation. This film was dropped in 2022. It's rated PG-13. Has a runtime of an hour and 45 minutes. Okay, so to start, I don't think that this film was marketed very well at all. I don't think enough people heard about it. I guess you could consider it indie, but it didn't have an indie vibe. It just felt like maybe they didn't have the biggest budget, or maybe that wasn't really the problem. The marketing just didn't, get as much traction as they would have liked or should have had, and so on and so forth. I just don't think that it was the best. But because I am a huge fan of watching trailers, and I tend to go to the theater a lot, I was able to see the marketing for this, and then I went ahead and watched the film when it came out. The director is Jessica M. Thompson, by the way. Okay, so this episode I'm going to talk about a few things, but mostly I'll be summarizing / reviewing, critiquing The Invitation as a film that I'm still suggesting you to go and watch and experience. But as I go through some of the summary and plot, I'll pinpoint certain things and certain themes and tropes that I think that I'm seeing a lot with, past films in the same genre of horror and thriller, which this film falls under that category, and how that's sort of re-emerging, a more modernized version in 2020, the 2020s, I guess, and just how I'm noticing certain things and just some critiques about this genre that I don't tend to love all the time unless it's a thriller, and scary movies are not my favorite, to be honest. But I really like for films like this to get some notice, and that's why I do commentaries. So basically, The Invitation. Oh, and I'm going to do a little bit of comparing because this film reminded me a lot of another film as a very similar vibe to it. And that's no hate towards Jessica, the director of this, but the similarities are uncanny. And I mean, I saw this other film that actually came out before The Invitation, years before this film. And as I was watching this film, I thought about that film. So we'll get into it later. So our main character's name is Evie. She's currently working in side gigs for catering, but she has an education and a strong interest in art. And she recently lost her mother, and maybe not that recent, but recent enough, and I mean to the point where she's listening to voicemails of her mother's voice, and she's still grieving her mom. I think she lost her dad a while, years and years before, and so we sort of see her going through that. It seems like her only sort of peace of mind is with her art and her best friend, who becomes a voice of reason and a lot of comedic relief in the film. I think Evie is biracial. Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of racial undertones in this film that the director does tend to spark up conversation about between her and her best friend, who is a dark-skinned Black woman, and she's great. And I do think that it's done in a playful and tasteful way that, when you joke about yourself, it's one thing, and other people joke about you, it's not, right? So I think Evie's definitely biracial, half Black, half white, and I'm bringing that up because it does sort of show up a lot in the film, and with the differences and cultural differences between some of the characters. Some of them are British, Old English, and she's American, and she currently lives in New York, and she travels to go see these other people in the film. I'll explain later. And so that comes up with classism and colonialism and old money, which is basically just saying colonialism and genocide in a very sugar-coated word. But anyway, so Evie is experiencing that in her real life, so she's really vulnerable, and she's really hoping for some form of comfort in the form of family, and that is actually used against her. And at one of these catering gigs, she gets one of these DNA kits. I think that was the whole point of the gig. It was like something about a DNA kit, and that's a whole other loop into what's going on, other words, and another process of the plot. And so she decides to take the DNA test in hopes that maybe she can find out more about her family and herself. And she does happen to have a cousin that she didn't know about. And her friend sort of jokes like, oh, that's the whitest man I've ever seen in my life. And she says it a lot, actually. And in one way or another, she ends up going to meet this cousin, this male white cousin, for like brunch or lunch or dinner, I don't know. They meet at a restaurant, and he's like talking to her, and they're getting to know each other, and he talks about his family and like how they didn't know they had any other family, and they're so excited and they want to meet her and all these things, and she's happy to meet him. She kind of clues him into what she's been going through and blah blah blah. So it's sort of like a reunion in a way, and he invites her to like this wedding and uses it as an excuse for her to just like reconnect to her other side of the family. And at first she's hesitant because obviously she doesn't know him, and the first thing that he wants to really do outside of this little meeting is to go fly across the country to a place she's never been to with a bunch of strangers. Red flag number one. And even her friend sort of, Evie eventually agrees, but even her friend's kind of like, okay, I don't know about that, but if you're gonna go, you know, just make sure you take a picture of the license plate and you tell me where you are and you check in with me. Sort of like a girl's girl, you know. Girls have different methods of taking care of each other within their groups. You know, tell me when you're going here, don't go to the bathroom alone, you know, wait till you go inside your house before I drive off. Things like that. That's how it kind of feels. And anyway, that's what they do. And then Evie goes, and there's another red flag where she runs into one of the workers that's, I guess, setting up for all the people that are going to be visiting this like old castle that she ends up going to. And by the way, this just screams like old Gothic. Like, it just feels like an old Gothic tale for this huge castle. It looks super old. You can tell that they're like old money rich, not new rich. And it's in somewhere in the UK, so colonialism is like undoubtedly the reason why they're rich. So it's just all these things that are just piling up right away. And then Evie goes and she like accidentally hits one of the workers, and Evie knows what it's like to be on the other end of that, and so she's trying to be nice and she's trying to help her clean up the glass, and she owns up to her mistake right away. And then the butler, who's like in charge of everything and how the place runs and this castle runs, is like immediately super rude, super dismissive, and just has this weird ego superiority complex, and he's just very disagreeable, and you just don't like him right off the bat. And then like the man of the house who actually owns all this, who's supposedly just lending his home for this wedding for the family and everyone to visit because he's like an old friend of the family, whatever, steps in, and that's when she first meets him. So DeVille is like the guy, comes from old money, really handsome. And I'm just gonna say this now, if this wasn't a horror film and like DeVille's character didn't turn out to be a terrible, narcissistic, evil prick, this would be a perfect Gothic romance with a little bit of a dark element. They're both super gorgeous. They both look great together on screen. It's awesome. I just have to say that right now. Okay. So now that we're past that, they have like a cute little tit for tat, her standing her ground, him understanding. Good chemistry there. And then the cousin that introduced her originally comes into the picture, lets her know, this is the guy who owns this house. And she's like, oh, taking it back a little bit, but still standing her ground because she was trying to defend the workers and those two ladies that she hit the glass, she caused the problem, whatever. And so that's a red flag, but I digress. Then she's introduced to her room. She meets her maid. She's kind of shocked that she has a maid. Kind of feels uncomfortable about it, but whatever. And then the maid tells her about these birds that constantly hit the window and then like die, which is another red flag, but okay. You gotta watch the movie to understand how weird that is. Evie's really enamored by a lot of the art and the history of the art in the castle, building, whatever. Okay, fast forward in through, she meets all these old men who are related to her. She finds it really sweet in the beginning, but, and there's a lot of men. You're noticing there's a lot of men. Too many, in fact, if I could be honest. And a lot of the women are like the workers, the maids, people that aren't even related in the family. And then there's like a scene before where you start to see more women, but there's two main women who really have like the power, and people introduce them. I mean, they're out at this like outside venue party celebrating. They still haven't met the bride and groom. Another red flag, but okay. Again, let me just say this. Evie had so many red flags to the point where there's a point where she almost leaves but then doesn't, because she's sort of gaslit into not leaving and like sweet talked into not leaving, which is whatever. But I just think it's weird that like you have so many red flags and you just don't listen to them. I think it's a choice at some point. And I also think it's really unrealistic, which a lot of horror genres and films have done. I mean, from the 80s, 1980s to early 2000s, especially with their POC and black characters, where they, for one, kill them off right away, which is really fucked up. It feels like they use POC and black characters just to fill up space so that they can eventually get to the final characters. So that's pretty fucked up. But there's also like an actual sort of system that works for this trope of the final girl, which does come to play in this film, I think, in a different way, but in a definitely similar way. But also for any people of color or black people, and there's a difference, which is why I'm saying it differently, they don't really need that many red flags to be like, okay, I'm leaving, right? And so Evie staying so many times against her gut feeling is ridiculous, especially when her best friend, who calls in every now and then throughout the film, is like kind of being like, that's really funny, but maybe you should come home. She's definitely the voice of reason. I don't find it surprising at all. I mean, the first sign of a threat in real life, we're running for the hills. It's so unrealistic. I'm just saying, the only way that, I mean, let's be honest, the only way that I think like POC or black people, where like the first person to die is going to be a person of color, is like if the majority, or statistically your whole group, is like black and POC, and then like someone gets hurt, and that's like the main red flag is someone got hurt, and that means everybody else is going to leave, and it's going to be a fight. Okay, that's realistic. Okay, because it's fight or flight every other day in the real world. There's no fucking way. There are worse things, even worse things in the real world than Freddy Krueger, okay? I'm just saying, from a real life experience. Believe it or not. Believe it or not. He's definitely made a character that's very realistic to some things that go on in the real world, but let's just say there have been worse things that have happened to POC and black people. Facts. Anyway, that's the only thing about Evie that I didn't like in terms of her character and her agency. I feel like she kind of became the, oh, I'm running, I fell sort of character, where it's like, why are you falling right now? Other than that, there's like these slews of like mini dinners, parties, whatever, where she's meeting DeVille and their chemistry is building, and you can tell that he's definitely sweet talking her and flirting, and she's kind of giving that energy back. She does make sure that they're not related. That, again, I'm bringing that up because that is definitely something POC or black person would do. I know people are like, well, duh, you want to make sure. Well, she's making sure because like she's here with a bunch of really older white people, mostly men, who have known each other for generations. Who knows, I mean, colonialism, who knows that history, right? Dark. And so she's like, right off the bat, we're not related, right? Like, at all, right? That's actually in the film. I thought it was a really good question. Okay, and when she confirms that they are indeed not related, her and DeVille, they end up kissing, and like I said, I think that would be really good as a dark romance if this had not taken a turn. You also see that another one of the women in the film, one of them is really nice to her, kind of like a little sister, wants to go under her wing, but not completely freed of guilt. And then the other one who basically like bullies her, scares her in the night, which is another red flag. She's having nightmares and she's waking up feeling like someone's watching her. And you also see like a lot of the helpers are being told to do like extra night duties, and then they don't come back from those duties. And you see that like some sort of monster, which feels like it's a vampire, and we find out it basically is a vampire of some sort, but like a darker, cooler, mysterious version, are killing off the workers. So basically the workers are basically there as food. Also the workers, like they're given names mostly because Evie goes out of her way to ask them what their names are, and like she remembers their names, like details like that, because she's not objectifying them. But everyone else is like even on their uniforms, they have numbers, which is very dehumanizing and fucked up. And then eventually we get into this climactic point where Evie and DeVille have like this hot steamy night or whatever. And then they wake up the next morning, and they go to this dinner where, again, she thinks she's going to meet the bride and groom. By the way, she still has not met them. It's been like days. Like, come on, Evie. They're not there. And then that's like the climactic point where she's wearing like this gorgeous red dress, and like they're at this dinner brunch. I don't know. There's a lot of dinners. And they basically tell her, like, you're going to marry DeVille to keep our bloodline intact. By the way, we're vampires, which they show in a very graphic, grotesque manner, but it's fitting for this film. And then, hint, hint, the dark red dress. And then she's scared, she's shocked, she tries to run, they don't let her leave. They like knock her out or something, because he tells the other two ladies to get her ready or for whatever. And so that happens. The film is basically Evie fighting for her life, God, sadly, and trying to get away. We do, from, DeVille, he shows his true self. He basically lied to her to try to get on her good side, to get her to like him. And then once that is successful, he's inviting himself in a new form, like, oh, you agreed that you wanted to be with me, you wanted to know my secrets, without her really knowing like how deep those secrets were, and basically him lying to her and manipulating her like a lot of men do. Okay, and I'm bringing up sexism here, okay, because it's very clear that a lot of genres do this, but women on screen, especially even in horror, they tend to be objectified. They tend to only be wanted for what they can give to you and not who they are, dehumanized. Even with this whole like plot line of them wanting Evie is to continue their bloodline and to use her at her expense without her consent, while trying to manipulate some form of coerced consent and then trying to claim it as consent, which it is not consent, and then just making her deal with the consequences of what they've put her into and trying to victim blame her, basically by forcing her to get married, forcing her to, oh, drink my blood, it's a blood oath, so that you can take some of my powers for a minute, and then you can be one of us, immortal, blah, blah, blah. And it's just tragic. It brings up the whole point of female rage, which I think is a really, really interesting genre when done correctly. The women almost becoming this other version, this darker, animalistic version of themselves, to have to pull themselves out of the pits of hell because of nothing that they did wrong, just the way the world, often men who create a lot of the systems, have made them have to become. And so that's really valid. And so the theme of female rage and the brutality and the bloody and violence of it all comes up. And then you kind of have Evie being this final girl, especially in the second half of the film, because even though she didn't go into that castle with a group of unsuspecting people that get, knocked off one by one, and then having the final girl, she does meet the criteria. There were other women who did not succeed, whether because they didn't fit a certain, need for these terrible men, or because they kill themselves, which actually happened to escape their nightmare, which we see a flashback of that right in the beginning of the film, which is a descendant of one of Evie's family members. And then Evie basically like fights for her life and has to suffer, almost like she has to like earn the fight, right? Which is really fucked up because she didn't do anything wrong. But anyway, it happens all the time. And then she ultimately ends up winning. You see her fighting several different people. Some people help, but they're not, excluded from guilt because they still aided in getting her there and trapping her there. Her almost getting away, her almost leaving, and then ultimately giving in, letting them think she's giving in, and then fighting back brutally for her life, for the life that she deserves. Anyway, and getting her revenge on Deville in the end, but then later we cut to and see that she is still going back for each of those men that did get away in the fire that she started at the end, which ultimately killed everyone. But she did fight. You'll see. And she, screaming, fighting, man. Oh my God. That's why I say animalistic. I'm just thinking about it again. She goes back at the end, and it almost feels like they're setting up for a sequel, but ultimately she's going back to get that cousin that started all this because he had gotten away, and she's going to get everyone else who got away that night. As she should. Okay. And her friend's helping her because that's her bestie. And then, okay, what else did I want to talk about? I brought up female rage, and I brought up the final girl because those things are really valid, and I feel like they're a little different from what they used to be, but they're still there. Also, with the final girl trope, I should also mention that Evie, often, and it's even said in some of these films, like how they see women as lesser, they objectify you, they want you as cattle, basically, they want you to be seen but not heard, they want you to have babies, so on and so forth, but nothing else matters, which is really, really fucked up. And then you have this like docile, native, because of your youth, purity, the white dress getting ripped to shreds as you're fighting for your life, and you're having to experience the brutality of life, but only because of what they're putting onto you, not because it has to be that way. And then, that dress being stained with blood basically is exactly what happens to Evie in the end. And I did mention that there was another film that I wanted to talk about in comparison, and that film is Ready or Not, which was released in 2019. And Grace is the main character in that film, and it's different in this film, but it's so similar that I wanted to bring it up because I feel like a lot of people who have seen both films are going to compare it, and there are differences, and I do, had some critiques about The Invitation. For the most part, I think that it's a great film. I really like it. I do think it's a bit dark, and it makes sense because it's a horror film, and they're in this dark castle and stuff, and most of the time it's pretty well lit and it's great, but I do wish that more darker films weren't so like, I'm literally squinting my eyes so I can see this right now. Like, I feel like there should be a better way with these newer films to be like, it's dark and we get it, the aesthetic, the theme, but can we like still be able to see the film a little, other than that, I don't really have any other critiques. I really liked it. I feel like it's going to be a cult classic if it isn't already, and mark my words, it will be. Okay, now Ready or Not, I wanted to bring up because it has a lot of the same tropes, and I think people should watch it, but I'm not going to dedicate a whole commentary to it just because I feel like it's so much like The Invitation, and I just like The Invitation a little more because of how they bring up sort of racial issues and things like that. And having a black female lead, even though she is a light-skinned biracial woman, and that's a whole other thing, but it still counts. But, there's things that could be critiqued about that as well. I'm not going to get into that today. Ready or Not has a woman who goes into something unsuspecting. She wants to get married to her, at that time, I guess, fiance, who she's known for almost 2 years. She actually goes into, this rich family of her fiance, has this like castle-like house, suspecting, that she's going to get married. So that's a bonus. But she doesn't know that once she gets married, they always have this tradition of playing a game, and if you pull a certain card, they have this like ritual where they have to, it's called hide and seek, right? But they have this like dark element to it, like you're the one who has to hide, we seek you, but if we find you, we kill you, because that's a part of the ritual. Because basically this family has a history of the reason why they're rich and they're successful in like the game industry, which is how they make their money, why they use games as they're like coming into the family after marriage, is because their family members sold their souls to basically stay rich, which is very fitting, I suppose, for the rich. And everyone that gets married, it's not just tailored to the women in the family, it's anyone. So if the women want to marry a man and he pulls a hide and seek card, it's the same thing, and it has happened in their family before. Very dark, very like graphic, but it's still really good. And you know, you have some people who decide to help her, some not. Basically, the husband knew that they were going into this. She has to fight for her life. She becomes the final girl. She becomes like animalistic to survive. You know, there's no mercy if she wins in the end, basically. But I'm summarizing it because it's so similar to The Invitation, although I don't think that it has a drastic like part 1, part 2. Like The Invitation has more of like the before, the climax, the after, and then Ready or Not is more like unsuspecting for the beginning, lovey-dovey, getting to know just the awkward, weird rich family, and then right away, and then throughout the rest of the film, it's her fighting for her effing life, like right away. But it's so good, and I had to bring it up because it's so similar in a lot of ways, although they're not vampires. There's dark humor too. Grace's character doesn't really have anyone but her fiance, who she's pissed at for valid reason because he set her up basically. And again, men just like screwing you over, and then other women who participate in that also being problematic and aiding into their own oppression. It's a whole other discussion. But yeah, really enjoy both of those films. You should go watch The Invitation. I'm not going to do a quote segment because I couldn't really find a lot of quotes on IMDb, and I don't really have the time to go and like watch the film and be like, oh, this quote, this quote, this quote. But I do think there's a lot of very quotable things in The Invitation. You should watch both Ready or Not and The Invitation, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.
I hope you all burn.